Bien, je propose qu'on commence cette 9e séance. Alors, avant de commencer, nous allons faire cette séance en anglais, entièrement en anglais. Donc je n'ai quand même à préciser. Donc, cette séance, du coup, est intitulée Decolonising the Digital. So just before starting, exceptionally, today's session will take place a bit differently than usual. Since one of our guests, Nkonde, will not be able to join us before 7 p.m. So we will first listen to our first guest, Dr. Anaïs Nony, and have a first round of questions for her. Then around 7 p.m., we will listen to Mutale and Nkonde, with whom Anaïs Nony will be able to converse right afterwards. And finally, we will keep a question round about 20 minutes at the end of the session. So please don't hesitate to send us your questions at the first presentation. I remind you that it is possible to ask your questions directly to our guests by raising your virtual hand or by sending your question in the chat box. As usual, I will just let the floor to the director of the chair in geopolitics of risk, Peter Burgess, to remind us the former session we had and to introduce the main concept that will probably emerge on this today discussion.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon in particular to Anaïs Nony. Thank you for being with us today. We're really glad to have you. For the benefit of everybody, in the last session, we took our horizon scan of the geopolitization of uncertainty and risk to the question of terrorist attack as risk. And of course, terrorism, as we know, is not a new phenomenon, certainly not in France, but in some ways it has been transformed in the recent years by what we could call the rise of the discourse of uncertainty. So I think you could say that the threat of terrorism has become more present, more acute, and maybe even more terrorizing, but not because it is actually more present and more acute, but rather because our uncertainty about it has become more intense. And in some ways, what we heard in the expose of Emmanuel Pierre-Guité was an attempt to confront this uncertainty. And if you remember, he did so, he confronted it by applying a range of typologies, by debunking a certain number of myths, by suggesting strategies for mastering logistical uncertainty and for eliminating subjectivity from the equation. And then we raised the discussion, the question in the discussion, if you remember, about whether measures for reducing security don't ultimately increase insecurity by masking the fact that the source of insecurity is not, at least not completely, political violence itself, but rather the uncertainty that surrounds political violence. And then secondly, to this perspective of trying to dismantle terrorist threat, the threatenedness of terrorists by decomplexifying, by demystifying it, Mathieu Langlois, our doctor from the Règle, he described how his work and the work of emergency responders is somehow about embracing or navigating the complexity instead of trying to overcome it in some way. So it's a matter of giving way to the complexity, going with the complexity, which makes me think of this title by Donna Haraway, the feminist post-humanist theoretician, who's titled a book, it seems to me, called Staying with the Trouble. And that brings us to today, to the question of the digital and decolonizing the digital, which in some sense, of course, also begs the question of what it can mean to colonize the digital. I'm sure we'll come back to all of that. The internet began, of course, many of you know, I'm sure, in the 1990s as a libertarian fantasy, in some sense, a space of total freedom and openness. You might remember the famous John Perry Barlow text, the Declaration of Independence of cyberspace, which essentially fetishizes this absolute liberty of the internet. But as we know, as everybody knows and experiences on the body every day, the digital realm is today everything but a space of liberty. It's a space of huge power struggles. And it's really required us to reconceptualize both power and what we think power is, because we have to understand how power circulates in the digital. So it's different than the usual forms of power: material, kinetic, symbolic, social, cultural, as you like. Digital power somehow carries with it uncertainties as well, uncertainties, and maybe even a new concept of uncertainty. And it does this because it generates new unknowns, new kinds of questions, new mysteries about where power is going, where it's coming from. What is digital power? Where is digital power? What are the rules of the economy of exchange of digital power? What governs the flow of the digital? How does it colonize the internet? And how can it, of course, be decolonized? That's our question for the evening. So I'm very much looking forward to the presentation of Anaïs Nony and then exchange with Mutale and Nkonde afterwards, and give the floor back to Sarah for the introductions. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. So I will start to introduce Mutale and Nkonde, who I remember will join us in a little hour, about 7 p.m. So Mutale and Nkonde is an artist, a policy analyst, a member of the TikTok Content Moderation Advisory Board, and she also works as United Nations advisor on race and artificial intelligence. In 2019, she led a team that introduced the Algorithmic and Deepfakes Accountability Acts and No Biometric Barriers to Housing Act to the US House of Representatives. And she is now the CEO and the founder of Artificial Intelligence for the People, which is a nonprofit communications agency that produces contents that empowers general audience to combat racism in the technology sector. Mutale Nkonde is in the process of writing her first book, named Automated Anti-Blackness: Why We Need to Name Race to Create Just Technological Futures, as faculty fellow at the Notre Dame Institute of Advanced Study. So I'm sure we will have the occasion to ask her more about the subject she develops in her book project. Now I have the pleasure to introduce you, Anaïs Nony. Hi, and thank you again for accepting to present some of your research work today with us. You are lecturer in media arts and politics in the department. Let me check just to be sure. Yeah, the Department of French at University College Cork, and chercheuse associée with the Laboratoire de Recherche Histoire des Arts et des Représentations at the Université Paris-Nanterre. Before joining UCC, you held several doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships in France, in the United States, and in South Africa. Your work focuses on arts, sciences, and technology, and questions the impact of technologies of psychic and social life. You have published several articles on these aspects, on these subjects, but two of them might be specifically interesting for our today's session, I think. One published in 2017 in Parallax, entitled New Techniques of the Digital, and another one more recently published in 2019 in Philosophy Today, called Technology of Neocolonial Epistemes. So dear Anaïs, we are very impatient to hear more about the subjects. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. So you can see the PowerPoint, okay? The size changes on Zoom, but it's the right square, okay. So thank you so much to the organizers, Sarah Perret and Peter Burgess, for inviting me. Thanks to Mutale and Nkonde for being part of the panel, and thank you to the students for their participation. I look forward to your questions, and thank you to my students in particular for taking the risk to be part of a year-long seminar on Francophone decolonial thoughts. So today I will engage a few of the challenges brought about algorithmic biases in the age of automated decision-making. I will present you the work of major scholars and practitioners who interrogate how predictive analytics impact people's life and how technology design is shaping policymaking with drastic consequences for people and for politics. Hopefully, this discussion will lead me to clarify what I mean by decolonizing the digital, a title that was given to this panel that is part of the program on the geopolitics of risk. In recent years, experiments in automation have revealed major biases in the discriminatory structures of certain digital technologies, especially when involving machine vision, AI recognition, and predictive analytics. The rise of racist robots, the compromising deficiencies of Google recognition technologies, as seen in this infamous experiment, where darker shade skins are predominantly categorized as holding guns, are only but few examples of the danger of increasingly automated societies. Ones that do not carefully engage the discrete, coded gaze and profound racist structure of what Joy Boalawani calls the pale-male dataset. For Professor Latanya Sweeney, the first African-American woman graduating with a PhD in computer engineering at MIT, technology design is the new policy maker. For her, it's now a matter of civil rights that tech companies and governmental agencies acknowledge the impact of discriminatory procedures that are coded into digital systems of information and communication. Her vision is shared by prominent scholar Rua Benjamin, who coined the term the new Jim Code to address how a range of discriminatory designs encode inequity. Her work demonstrates the productive power of race in a capitalist and carceral society, explicitly showing the ways in which technologies are used to produce, amplify, and sustain racial hierarchies. In Race After Technology, she warns against the tendency to outsource human decision onto risk assessment tools that replicate social divisions. Her work offers ways to conceive of the importance of science and technology and urges us to continue to critique and transform the narrative around modernity and progress. This decolonial practice of knowledge making is also found in the collection of essays edited by Wendy Shan and Lynn Jorick, where the relation between race and technology is understood as being intrinsically linked to one another. To a certain extent, technology, capitalism, and race seem to share a recursive dimension, one that implements behavioral responses that are symptoms of what Paul Gilroy calls volatile racism, a racism that modulates power dynamics according to its best interest. A racism that can be as volatile as the market and as fluctuating as the system that generates and legitimizes it. In fact, and too often, technologies of scientific knowledge, such as machine learning and informational networks, are used as alibi for the implementation of neo-colonial values that dictate the trajectory of societies. Scientific projects that, for example, promote the testing of pharmaceuticals on individuals in third world countries privilege beings based on categorical understandings of race, class, gender, and ability. Such projects not only legitimize structural hierarchies among subjects, as seen in the use of cephalometric technologies in imperial systems of exploration. They also sustain the cultural framework of values that segregate collective beings on a global scale. In line with the writers cited above, I pose that the colonial subjects of scientific exploration have much in common with the neo-colonial subjects of technological systems of governance. My work focuses on the intersectional relation that automatic systems of control share with models of segregation and structures of knowledge oppressions. By intersectional relation, I refer to the fundamental work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who crafted the theory of intersectionality to center Black women's experience within interlocking layers of oppression, such as race, class, gender, and ability. Crenshaw helps us move away from a single axis framework that had previously dominated understandings of social progress in the sciences and technologies. In the context of the emergence of cybernetic systems of governance, such an intersectional perspective allows us to locate technological systems that promote, shape, and sustain discriminatory operation, as seen in Safia Umoja Nomol's book, Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. Responding to the power of algorithms to operate within our daily lives, I propose to think of our contemporary moment as that of a society of preemption. Preemption, pardon?
Excuse me, it's a blank.
Yes, it is blank because it's
okay.
It's my work, so I'm not.
Okay, I just wanted to be sure that's normal. Okay,
Yes,
thank
it
you.
is.
Sorry.
Thank you. So preemption defines the action of taking away something before an opportunity emerges or is actualized. By coupling anticipatory algorithms and preemptive technologies, like the premeditation of future events prior to their occurrence, as exemplified in popular culture by Minority Report, state apparatuses force upon their subjects a modality of control that forestalls behaviors according to a massive system of data mining and digital profiling, as seen in the recent implementation of the Chinese credit score system. In this society of preemption, data are not simply voluntarily exteriorized onto technical supplements. They are extracted from individuals by devices that dictates events and program behavior. In a society of preemption, not only are opportunities preempted, before individuals, but data about individuals are being collected before they are recognized as information. While machines require their users to exteriorize their knowledge and skills voluntarily, users of digital devices now see their agency being stolen away by algorithms that automatically target all kinds of relations, movements, behaviors, habits, and patterns to draw a digital double of the self. Such digital doubles are the algorithmic shadow of the individuals. But this shadow does not follow the user. On the contrary, the user blindly follows the shadow of suggestions, feeds, offers, and advertisement that trap their behavior and condition their possibility for growth. Preemption is thus automatized and systemic, much like discriminatory biases, meaning that their programmatic power discovered in the digital a structure that multiplied the expansion of its logic. In other words, preemptive logic creates the circumstances of its deployment by forestalling their possibility from emerging. In the case of the geopolitics of risk, threats are a form of preemption. This type of preemption has been increasingly deployed since September 11, 2001, because the logic of preemption creates its own condition of possibility. Preemption is first and foremost a time concept that denotes acting on the time before the time of threat, before it has emerged as a clear and present danger. Thus, the threat becomes the motives of a political strategy that imposes an hegemonic interpretation of a situation to satisfy a political agenda. Here, the logic of preemption refers to the making up of a problem to justify the means toward an end that is usually unknown to the people affected by the execution of these strategies. Often carried by motives that are kept undisclosed, the logic of preemption deploys strategies that are hard to counteract. In other words, the society of preemption feeds the black box of political strategies. In this context, the question of governmentality and surveillance is taking on a new dimension in the 21st century, as is being analyzed by Antoinette Rouvroy under the important concept of algorithmic governmentality, whose target is the, quote, unrealized part of the future, the actualization of the virtual, end of quote. Such governmentality calls for a new form of politics that is aware of the predictability and programmability of behaviors as new forms of discipline and discriminatory strategy. To address what the society of preemption does and to unveil the strategy it deploys, one must turn to new forms of political challenges developed in the era of digital policing and profiling. Finally, let me conclude on a pressing issue, and let's talk about an app launched in the early 2020 and geared towards the citizen surveillance of the police. Created by Amal Bentounsi, a French lawyer who lost her brother killed by the French police, UVP is free and was designed to prevent systemic police impunity. Through the app, the images can be instantly captured, uploaded, and stored on a cloud. The images cannot be erased and can then be used as proof and be shown in court to restore justice and stand against false reports. In other words, the app encourages a participatory surveillance of the police force. It offers a tool to counteract the systematic biases that are so deeply rooted in the carceral and police institution of our societies. Almost 30 years after the very first viral video of police brutality, namely the one that captures the beating of Rodney King by the Los Angeles police, one cannot but continue to urge for a careful understanding of surveillance, for a detailed critique of whom craft narratives and codes that continue to dictate understanding of security, public interest, and progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anaïs.
Thank you.
So I remember that we will have a first round of questions right now. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand or just add your question in the chat box. We have a question from Alice Coupeff. So I will let you the floor. Please go ahead.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for the presentation. I was just interested about the app that you mentioned, the UVP, the Urgence Violence Policière. From what I understand, there's a law that is either going to be passed or I believe has been passed recently, which precisely will limit the possibility to share images that of policemen and police women in France. Do you know anything about how, as in whether this app will still be legal to be used, or kind of any, I guess, civilian protest against the law? Sorry, I'm not sure if that's clear, but I can. Yeah.
No, that's an excellent question. I think I won't be able to respond about what will happen, but what I can say and what I can talk about is the tension that are going on. So why I decided to talk about this app today is because there is a very immense effort to invisibilize this app. It has been launched almost a year ago now. It's the outcome of years of work with lawyers and engineers, computer engineers. And now that we are precisely in the middle of decolonial forms of uprisings and riots due to the police violence on Black bodies and minorities, this app is being completely overshadowed by other discourse. So it was important for me to just talk about it as we talk about decolonizing the digital, because it really is doing the work of what we can call algorithmic justice. And so I don't know what will happen. The law has passed. Now they are trying to change a little bit the infamous Article 24 that targets the question of being allowed or not to share images of police. But it's really to also show the audience about modalities of of using algorithm and using the cloud and using structures that are digital for the sake of justice. So yes, but thank you. I hope I was able to answer a little bit, but I don't know what's going to happen. I just know that there is a massive protest against the law again on Saturday, and it's been going on since the since we had heard of this law.
Thank you, Anaïs. You have another question from Jalal Fari. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this impeccable organization, especially the choice of this subject of them that I find interesting. My question relates to two axes. The first one about the reality of free use of data by numbers of internet sites, like our personal data and our browsing experiences, which are the main material and the main commodity of GAFAM, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, etc. Yes, it is true that we can use those sites free, but in the other hand, those sites invest our browsing, our experience, our data, that they resell at excessive prices to the companies which can use them as to target the needs, their needs of their potential customers. The second axe of my question concerns if we can consider digital labor, the travail digital, as a real work or not, and if we are able today to protect or even enhance our personal data and our browsing experience, which is now in the hand of this kingdom of GAFAM as commodity, as marchandise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting questions. So I like the fact that in those two questions, the common word is commodity. So users' data has a humongous value, and it has potentially become a bigger values and attention in the attention economy. So in the digital economy, the data we produce is what feeds the system to an extent that it can then preempt or create the structure that will design the new needs and the new desire and the new wants of the consumer. The ambivalence of the digital is that it always is offering the best and the worst at the same time. I mean, Peter Burgers reminded us of the fact that the web emerged out of a visionary participatory culture where the contribution of the small number was benefiting the biggest number of users. We are in a complete opposite system of hierarchies and value in the digital. So our data is has become one of the most abstract form of value, in the sense that we don't even have the information to where and how and to whom our data benefits. And it doesn't even translate into information to us. We have a vague idea that there are hundreds of cookies following and tracking us constantly, and that there are probably 1,000 of radars on every move we make, from our banking account to our kids attending a certain school to our choice of going to this biocop or not. But the fact is, we don't perceive it as information. Data hasn't become accessible as information to us users. So there is almost an epistemological gap or lacuna that prevent us from really engaging into the realm of what do we do as agent of our behavior online. So I really enjoy the work of Antoinette Rouvroy for this question. She's a philosopher of law, and most of the people, most of the women I've talked about today are advocate, lawyers, policy advocate. They work in government strategies. Mutale and Nkonde, who will join us, is also a policy maker, policy activist. So there is a real challenge in transforming the information into legal component. So us as agent, we can make claims, which is, if it sits on the layer of data, then we have absolutely no access. Digital labor is labor. It is the consequences of our use of the internet and of the web on the internet, economic, ecologic, and in terms of labor force, is beyond comprehension. The amount of people who are outsourced to police what is being said just on Facebook, we have hundreds of thousands of digital labor who are constantly underpaid, who are just here to work as a little algorithmic machine just to make sure that there are no glimpses in the system. And that's just one side, and it's not to talk about the mine in the Congo that produce the iPhone that we use and all of that. So that digital labor is labor in one part of the spectrum or the end part of the spectrum. It's labor all the way. The problem is that what we conceive as commodity has changed from the labor force that was coming out of like a factory with certain hours and certain leisure times, and the digital has completely transformed that. And for instance, a very short book that is very easy to read is Jonathan Crary 24/7, or the Capitalism or the End of Sleep, where the goal of the digital is that you can be a consumer while being at work by ordering something on the Amazon. You can be a consumer while taking care of your kids. You can be a consumer while dreaming in the night because you wake up and the first thing you do is checking your cell phone, and so on and so forth. So the question of commodity is central to both the users and the worker, if it responds to your question. There is someone else. Yeah,
thank you, Anaïs. It's really fascinating. Peter, would you like to ask something?
Yeah, I very much would. But there's also Jetta who's queuing.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't.
We have the time, but I thought you wanted to question something that on what Anaïs just said.
Yeah, indeed. And I wanted to also come back to this question of that Alice Gruppe took up about the global security law, which Anaïs answered completely, but I wanted to sort of hammer a little bit the point that I understand her making, Anaïs. And that is, of course, there are two answers to the question. The one is more sort of tabloid-like, and that is, would this law make the app of the that Anaïs was talking about illegal? And I suspect it would. I'm not a lawyer, but I suspect it would not be allowed because you couldn't differentiate between malicious and non-malicious use of the photograph or the film, and that's the key in the law. Although we'll see what it becomes when it's rewritten, as Anna said. But the more important point, I think, is this question about what's happening when we digitally reproduce something. What's happening to us? What's happening to the reproduction? There's an old and beautiful text which you should all read sometime, from Walter Benjamin, from the 1930s, and it's called The Work of Art in the Age of Technological Reproducibility. That's my translation. And it essentially says that art will never be the same now that we can reproduce it by printing and this kind of technology, because it's lost its aura. So art isn't just the material thing, it has an aura about it. It has a soul, it has a spirit. And when it's reproduced 1,000 times, we take a picture of something and reproduce it. We take a Picasso painting and we take a picture, then it loses something in that. And so the question becomes extrapolating, is something lost or gained when we reproduce digitally the picture of a cop, a policeman? Is there a kind of violence, a reprimand, a carcerality that's put onto the representation just by the fact that it's recorded? So the fact that you have a film of a cop doing anything you like, does it change the nature of the thing that the cop did in some sense? And the answer seems to be yes, that there's some sort of change going on, and that explains, or that stimulates the bigger question that I want to ask now. And then I'll give the floor to Jette. I mean, the basic theme, Anaïs, that you're coming back to again and again with different examples is that something is changed when we let our worlds be governed by algorithms, by digital processes. And one of the things that happens is that racism gets transferred. Right? When racism is reproduced. So racism in the thing that's being digitally reproduced, the racial relations, the inequalities, the oppressions come with it, come with the algorithmic reproduction of them. So processes that are racist become racist when they're subjected to algorithms as well. But then my question is there something more to this happen? Does the algorithm add oppression? Or does it just reproduce? Is it a transfer, a perfect transfer of the oppression? Or does it add oppression? Is there something more? And my feeling is that there is, just like when we let the police videos be reproduced and put in the cloud or wherever. Is there something more, a different kind of oppression that comes only from the technology and was not a matter of social or cultural oppression before we submitted the process to the algorithm? And it makes me think of this beautiful title of, you know, Antoinette Rouvroy. She's been in our seminar twice, actually. She's a friend of ours. And she wrote a beautiful article, I'm sure you've read it, it's called La vie n'est pas donnée. And it's, for you non-French speakers, it's playing on this, the word donné, which means data, but also given, which is the Latin root of data anyway. So it says in English, life is not given, which is kind of an English cliche. Don't take it for granted, you know. But it's also saying that life cannot be a digital data point. There's something more there, there's something greater, there's an aura. So I think that's what she's trying to get at, that algorithms and the things they reproduce, data and the things they reproduce are never equivalent. And our job is to try to understand the clash or the difference between them.
So I guess I finish with Benjamin, because yeah, I think it may be dangerous to collapse aesthetics and racial or segregative oppression that call for the need to capture forms of violence that otherwise would not be seen. Yes, the digital, so the increasingly automated structure of governance, surveillance, policymaking is adding to race, to gender-based violence, to misogyny, to fascism, and to the rise of extremist behaviors. And I locate that, and I'm not the only one, on a certain loop that it creates. I talked a little bit about cybernetics and the loop of a cybernetic network is that it implies input-output forms of response to, I send you a message, you respond. I send you a stimuli, you react. So the way in which we are increasingly shaped in our modality of behaving, and that's where Antoinette's work is so important, is that we are moved away and further away from forms of existence to forms of subsistence or survival. The addictive dimension of this cybernetic loop, where input-output on an Instagram platform is higher in terms of its addictive dimensions than heroin for a brain of an underage kid, is adding to a form of control where the psychic, the somatic, the intergenerational circuit that should prevent this kind of loss of the reason for what, you know, life is worth living, as the title of a book by a mentor of mine, Bernard Stiegler. It's really increasingly forcing into question, because we have the cultural understanding or cultural presumptions that technologies are neutral. We are not conditioned for thinking about technologies in the sense of digital automated technologies as that which we should learn how to use. I'm so afraid when I have to take on first-year students who spend 12 hours on their screen all day without any bodily contact or of any sort. Because this is producing the loss of the capacity and capability to imagine, to read, to deeply engage into questions that are not surface level. So yes, gaming is wonderful for multitasking, and we have research that can show that. And you know, we should all maybe teach in multitasking gaming environment. You know, that's maybe the future of of many fields. But to go back to reproduction, I love this piece by Walter Many. I mean, it's, I think, one of the greatest pieces of philosophy in the 20th century, and I encourage everyone here as well to read it. I think that the aura of the policeman who beats the fuck up of someone, I have a difficulty to compare, because what we've seen, for instance, last week, is that if a policeman didn't yell to his nearly 50 other police patriots that there was a camera on the street, what would have happened to kids who are even underage, who are 16? So I also have a fear that this app is going to be illegal. I think that's also why I talk about it, because if anyone is in France, you should download it. You should start using it if you see anything that goes wrong. But can I respond to one question that is by...
Actually, I will actually set the questions loud because of the recording.
Yes.
Recording cannot see the question. So I suggest to ask you all questions, and we will have another question directly to you from Anna Valdivia. So we have a first question from Ayrton Aubry. So he thank you for the wonderful presentation, and he has a question about the first example you presented with facial recognition that considers more easily Black skins as carrying weapons. Where does this bias come from? Was it implemented by the individuals who wrote the algorithm because of their own bias? So this is the first question. We have a question also from Yeta Bazikashi. Does this mean that among many ambiguities that of values is going to dominate the upcoming studies? Another question from Fiona O'Connell. She's wonder whether the bias in data sets, specifically regarding moves towards using automatic facial recognition in prosecution, the justice system can be corrected, or whether the pell-mell data sets that such systems are built on are so dominant across digital systems that it can't be balanced by deliberate input of more diverse data samples. We have another question from Angie Kail. So she feels that though the auric field of each of will be transmuted in some way, the observer effect, which she learned from physics videos, seems to be very influential on the algorithmic reproduction and reinterpretation. The algorithm changes in each intertextual layer, in her opinion, and she apologized for formatting the message in that way. I let the floor to Anna Valdivia for her question. Anna, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you, Anaïs, for your presentation. I really enjoy it. And well, I'm gonna I'm a computer scientist. I work in security flows with Sarah. And yeah, following like the argumentation of Peter. So I think that sometimes we focus a lot on the algorithms and on the data and less on the teams that design and implement those algorithms, because they are mainly like white males creating these algorithms that not like they don't think about how these technologies can really affect other communities. And yeah, I mean, and I would like to know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'll start with you and then go back in the question. Yes, it's of course it's both you know, the parameters that are used to shape the algorithm, and it's of course the team that will set those parameters for the algorithm to be tested and then deployed. In 2017, I gave a talk on AI and gender in France. And before that, since I spent so much time in the United States, I called a few AI engineers that were either in the United States or in Europe, in London and in Amsterdam. And there are just no question that it's important that there are female engineers in these teams. It's for them, it's because we are in the immaterial world, so-called immaterial world of the digital. The question of gender biases are absolutely not to be included and to be questioned. With the question of race, and I may try to answer the first question by Ayrton. There is something very specific about facial recognition and racial biases, is that most of the time it uses infrared technologies, while the infrared responds to light, and darker shade skins are going to absorb light. So there is something very off in the technology itself, such as at the beginning of photography, where there was like no ability to take pictures of darker shade skins, just because the camera was not thought for other faces than the pale male, pale face figure. So there is something about the fact that it arranges a set of parameters that needs to be taken into consideration. One in also being the specific technology being used. So
could I hop onto this? Could I intervene on this before we go on to the next one? Because this comes back to this fundamental question that I asked on a different level, and it's whether the people are racist or the machines are racist, or the technologies, not machines, technologies. So it's easy for us to see, I think, that if you have a group of coders who are all white men, that there's going to be some sort of bias in the coding, because when you code something, you say, well, what sort of choice would I make in that? And then let's put that in the code. And of course,
certainly politics, yes.
Yeah, exactly. But there's another kind of argument which says that it's the technology itself which is bringing racial bias, that it's the fact that we put a human experience through an algorithmic process at all, which creates oppression of a certain kind or racism of a certain kind. So, there's Mutale.
Hi, Mutale, welcome.
Thank you for being so understanding. I am so
pleasure to see you.
Sorry. I just, with COVID, whenever I can leave the house, I can't. So I appreciate you guys.
Pleasure. I'll finish quickly so we can move on. I mean, you're not going to blame the infrared camera because it can't see dark skin, right? The camera is not racist. But the one who chose the camera who was not sensitive to the fact that certain cameras see black skin better than or worse than white skin, this in some sense is a racial bias which is introduced. So again, what does it mean to say that technological processes are biased? I mean, it's a huge philosophical question, sorry about that, but I see again and again this idea that the profiling is happening outside, before the technology, before the process, or after it, but not in it. Or maybe it's a matter of how we define a technology.
And race, and racism.
And racism, sure.
I mean, I think it's wonderful that we're having this conversation. I am just gonna clarify that I am worried of the excuse that technology and the so-called apolitical dimension of its implementation in our society has. And the drastic consequences that we see in non-white communities. And that's why I was talking about this app that is to really try to counteract police violence that are really specific to a certain type of community, especially in France. I don't believe that there is one technology that is racist or not racist. I believe that there are technologies that are being designed to perform racist operation and task, to reinforce a form of cultural and political and economic structure. And so because the digital is implemented in every single ramification of our societies in the global north, but also impacting hugely what's happening outside, we have to call out what is being done and work against the fact that if we don't actively engage the justice component that is at the foundation of equity, then the technology that is being deployed is not going to be doing it for us. So I'll leave the floor here.
Thank you so much, Anaïs, for taking the time to respond to all those questions. And again, welcome, Mutale. Thank you so much for joining us. We know it's always a bit tricky with the time difference and this Zoom meeting we are trying to bring together. So thank you so much. I suggest to let you the floor right away and for about 20 minutes, and then we will come back to questions and discussion all together.
Excellent. Can I share my screen?
Yes.
Is that going to be perfect? I'm also famously bad at sharing my screen. And so please forgive me, proactively forgive me. Okay. Okay. So to all participants, please, my deepest apologies for being late. The time difference and being able to leave my apartment in New York meant that I had a conflict. But my name is Mutale Nkonde. I am a policy advisor, and I've been looking at race and AI in race and technology, I should say, since 2013. I came to this work through Google. I worked with a partner of theirs who were looking at why we had so few Black people working within the company who are Black and women, and realized very quickly that the way we think about diversity and inclusion in hiring was actually being mirrored into technical design. So kind of picking up on what Professor Burgess had said and Professor Nony, really thinking about this idea that we can design with a white eye. And I would agree that technologies themselves are agnostic, but the decisions that we make really reinforce our preference for whiteness. The way in which they're deployed can reinforce these histories of race and racism. When I was working in Congress, I led a team that introduced no biometric barriers to housing, which was looking at facial recognition because of the civil liberties and privacy implications. But specifically, the fact that the technology didn't work on Black skin, my argument was that this is not recognizing faces. Because if it recognized faces, it would recognize all faces, and at the same time, it was that further dehumanization of the Black body by not even recognizing it that was taking place. And there is a long history of that in New York City. Actually, we have a law from 1715, which was the Lantern Law, that meant that Black free people had to hold a light to their faces to make white people feel safe. And this was written about by Simone Brown in her seminal work, Dark Matters. But what it really speaks to was this deployment of the technology at the time, which was the lantern, to make white people feel safe through illumination of the Black face. So I'm gonna do a short presentation that kind of introduces you to the work that I've done on racial literacy in technology, just because I think that there's something very disempowering about speaking about the problem without thinking about a potential solution. And then I would like to open up the floor for questions and for discussion with my esteemed panelists who I'm so honored to be around. So very quickly, oh my, it's gonna work. This is, I mean, technology is so great. So this case study comes from a paper called Whiteness and Ai that was written by Steve Kaig and Kananta Dihau at Cambridge University. And it really helps illuminate some of my thinking and my work over the last couple of years. So I'm going to start with a video and then go on.
Say hello to Pepper. Pepper is high-tech, low-maintenance, and not your typical robot. Pepper's not here to replace humans or even vacuum the floor. Pepper is here to make people happy, help them grow, and enhance their lives. Think of it as high-tech. You can high-five. Awesome. Pepper can be incredibly helpful interacting with customers and solving problems or providing information. That's because Pepper is a friend, an advisor, and a business partner. In fact, there's only one thing Pepper isn't: a finished product. And that's where you come in.
And that's where the tech company asks us to complete their work by helping them finish this prototype. So why have I started with Pepper? So if I go back a couple of frames to here, oh, I'm sorry, this doesn't work. If I go to this frame where we're first introduced to Pepper, we'll see that Pepper is gendered as a woman, racialized as white, and thought to be a friend, thought to be helpful, thought to keep people's lives. And what Cave and Dihau theorized in their paper around whiteness and AI was, as we develop these technical projects, what we're also doing is reinforcing our understandings of the world and reinforcing the power dynamics that sit within current society, within these technical products. So if we think about Pepper, who quite frankly, they call her an assistant, but Pepper is actually a servant. What you do when you encounter Pepper is that you tell her what you want, you tell her what you want her to do, and then you task her with delivering this. And this is really consistent with the class of assistant robotics that we're now integrating into our wider life. When I was looking where I could buy a Pepper, I actually found one on eBay for $50,000. And on the bottom of the ad, it said, and Pepper uses facial recognition to recognize people that are coming to see you. There was no mention of the civil liberties implications of facial recognition use. There was no mention of the lack of efficacy for facial recognition. And there was also no mention of the tertiary markets that we see for facial recognition in the United States. Amazon, I was going to say book delivery company, but the everything company in the pandemic, you know, we're all kept alive via Amazon. Has a Ring doorbell product that is also facially recognized and enacted. Oh my goodness, I cannot speak English, but also contains facial recognition. And they have tertiary contracts with police forces, 1,300 in the United States, where those pictures can be sold. So during criminal investigation, what that can actually do is capture your face when you're innocent. That is a gross violation of our constitutional rights. And even though Pepper is meant to be your friend and you're meant to high five, Pepper has not been theorized to imagine an intelligence that sits outside of whiteness, or to imagine or theorize servitude that sits outside of femininity and womanhood. So Pepper and the robots like her of what I have been thinking about, certainly for the last 10 years, but more intensively for the last 3. I'm co-author on a report called Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech. And my response to Pepper and facial recognition and Google Maps that does not show the poorest neighborhoods in the United States, and all of these technologies that seek to marginalize and push Black people out of society, I did not feel that the designers were bad. I felt that there was a gap in the literacies of those that sit in product design teams. So when we're thinking about product design, and this extends, but I'm going to stay on product design for the interests of this short conversation, I would like to hear from you. We teamed up with a scholar called Howard Stevenson, who is here in the States. And racial literacy, he told us, has 3 component parts. So the first is that AI is not neutral. Pepper taught us a lot of things about AI designers and the people that sat in that particular company. It taught us that women serve, it taught us that intelligence was white, and it also taught us that part of service is doing that willingly. When the truth of it is, many of the people that are in service roles, particularly as we think about essential workers in the United States, are also people that do not have legal protections where they work. They do not have access to healthcare, and they're more likely to be racialized as Black and be poor. There is nothing neutral about making the most vulnerable people even more vulnerable through the way that we see them in society, and how that's now being encoded into AI systems. The second part of this idea of racial literacy is that this is an emotional endeavor. We see this, it's exciting for me to be in France with a French audience, but I do sit from the United States looking at some of the laws that have been passed very recently around recording the police, around not being able to collect racialized data, because there is this national discomfort with race. We are all French. We don't have race. We love cheese. We love wine. I don't know. I just made up those 2 things. I'm just making racist assumptions from the US. But this idea that how we show up in the world and it does not impact us leads people to ask, often in a very frustrated way, why does it always have to be with race? And when we were writing Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech, it was an ethnographic study where 30 of the engineers that we spoke to and product designers in Silicon Valley literally had never thought that there could be racism in America. And my co-authors and I had to really bring them back to histories of enslavement and colonization and how they've shaped power dynamics in our country, and watch them get really angry with us. And then we worked with them to bring this down. It's an emotional response that's born in this lack of literacy. It was also born in a lack of trust. I did not do interviews with white subjects because I wanted to hear what white people really thought about race. And as somebody who is racialized as Black, I would not be given that true entrance point. So working with a colleague of mine whose speciality is in whiteness and how white supremacist logics have been part of the technological project from the birth of the internet, went in and had some really interesting in-depth conversations about the lack of trust. And I didn't put it on this slide, but also the shame that many white people, particularly those of good conscience and particularly those who want to see a different reality, feel when histories of race and racism take place. But if we're ever going to get to an anti-racist future, we have to do this cognitive work of recognition and understanding that takes us through the emotional. So we actually discussed a scale that we can provide for people who are interested in doing this work to put them into a situation where they can actually have a productive conversation around this and not be marginalized as a result. So once we realize that AI is not a neutral product and that we cognitively have to understand how a facial recognition camera is the descendant of the Lambton Law in 1715, or we look at bail predictive instruments and see the history of wrongful incarceration and arrest of Black men, in particular in the United States, is encoded into these instruments that also repeat those patterns. Once we have the cognitive and we've gone through the emotional of saying that race doesn't matter when it does, the emotional of guilt and shame and not being able to have conversations with race across races that still in 2020, this report came out in 2019, but even then in 2019, a Black researcher could not do the work of learning about anti-Black racism with white subjects. If we could just think about that, that work could not be done. And then 2020 coming through this global uprising where my dreams were definitely came true when white people of good conscience really asked themselves the question, do Black lives matter? And what role do I have in the mattering or not mattering, and starting to do some of the beautiful work that I'm seeing, but also starting to do some undoing of that work. You know, Obama yesterday here in the United States really denigrated the language of the Black Lives Matter movement and encouraged us to move on because it was uncomfortable. So even grappling with that, you know, even grappling with this discomfort, this inability to talk about race is something that is shared across racial groups. How do we then move forward to building this anti-racist industry, this anti-racist and anti-colonialist scholarship to support this frame, right? How do we start understanding that as I'm speaking to you about colonialism, colonialism has always been a technical project. I am Zambian. And when the British forces came to Zambia, they came with guns, they came with tanks. These were not the technology of warfare that the Bemba people, my people, were combating them with. But because the spear is not as powerful a killer as the gun, they became supreme. So if we think about colonization and the analog being a technical process, and then we think about this reality that colonization in the analog, no, I did say that correctly. We start to think about the technical and how this understanding that technical supremacy, particularly that is developed in Silicon Valley, is reenacting and rediscovering these old patterns of racial abuse. We have to start to think, well, if we have the literacy, could things be different? And should things be different? And that is definitely where I sit in my scholarship. Advancing racial literacy isn't the only scholarship I've produced, but for the interest of 20 minutes, it's what I've spoken about. And in my own policy work, really looking at how meanings of race are communicated across social media, looking into the dis and the misinformation space, looking at how algorithms are developed and whether we should have impact assessment as part of the release system for algorithmic systems and for AI systems before they are released into the world market, as well as facial recognition. And I felt like I was the rude person that stormed into the dinner party, and amazing conversation was being had. And I kind of just was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. But really getting into some of those conversations as well, because the thing that I would leave you with is that we have designed racist pasts. And we have the power to design anti-racist futures. This isn't a fight that has not been won. This isn't something that's over. And this is really a call in to folks listening and folks across the world to join with us as we design and as we theorize futures that understand the cognitive reality of the power dynamics between races and how we've always used technology, whether they're lanterns or whether they are face scans, to enact that political process, the emotional work that has to be done so that we can listen and be in community of those of us who have minoritized voices, and really calling to women generally, because we, as we saw in the robot, Pepper was a woman because they think that we are lower than men. And they being the tech industry, not being gendered, not being personalized, but the systems of technology. And then think about action plans of where we can use this knowledge and take this knowledge and then create the future. So that's where I'm sitting on. And I would love to invite questions and to invite my panelists to really come in. And thank you for including me in this incredible conversation.
We're so happy you crashed into our dinner party.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mutale. I have plenty questions, but of course I will let the floor to our participants. But maybe I could just ask a very quick question on to both of you on those technologies and identity, because I think both of you mentioned this aspects. And especially in this context of the lack of reliability of those technologies. I think if we look at security policies and more generally risk management, there is this quest of identification that you both mentioned in your presentation, I think, and this desire to know a certain form of identity, which appears a bit standardized here. And so we take fingerprints, we scan our eyes, we measure our faces, and ultimately with results, and you both pointed it out very poorly, and sometimes even with dramatic consequences. I'm thinking here about maybe asylum seekers, some of whom have their lives dependent on the authentication of those technologies. So I was wondering if in your work, whether in your research, Anaïs, or in your interaction with institutional decision makers, Mutale, how is this significant a margin of error in technologies are taken into account here? One gets the impression that there is some denial here. So what is your experience in your dealings with those who carry these technologies as being more reliable than human being?
I can certainly speak to the work that I did in Congress, but also the UN advisory work, where the marketing of the technologies is often around cost and efficiency. And those two things are remarkably treasure. If you're thinking about a government that wants to be fiscally conservative, or you're thinking about huge agencies that want to serve the world, like these are good thoughts. So when you present the evidence that they don't work, it's complete and utter lack of belief, like complete. It's as if you have insulted, all four of their grandparents, every ancestor that they've ever had, and really are, really like are a Luddite. You're somebody that hates technology. You're somebody that just doesn't want this thing to happen. And this has been very difficult in the context of the work that I've done with COVID trackers, where I've had to point out that COVID trackers are not diagnostic tools. They will never be able to tell us if somebody has COVID. What they will do is create a social graph of where people move that sits on our phone. And that information is held by private companies, Apple and Google, one of which is building a biometric healthcare business. So the information that they could not get from us legally through health records, they're asking us to upload to this app. And we're giving away this barrage of rights. And I think what's really helped me in this, because I was incredibly marginalized at the beginning of this work, was Cambridge Analytica and what that did to the United States through the election of Trump. And then ultimately, the implications of having a president that didn't believe in science and watching 250,000 Americans die in the richest country of the world, because this lack of belief in empirical work and in scientific discovery, that those two horrible incidents have resulted in policymakers realizing we have to follow the science. We have to look at the science. So kind of 5, 6, 7, 8 years forward, I am now finding that large global institutional players are more accepting of this idea that the science couldn't work. And I'm actually working on a project with Amnesty International that is going to launch in January, where we're looking globally at some of the failures of biometrics, not just in the US, but the West Bank and New Delhi. I have project partners there. And the idea that the science doesn't work has finally been accepted. But I feel like we've used faulty technologies to misidentify, certainly in the criminal justice system, way too many people. We have 2 open cases here in the United States where Black men are suing the Detroit police station. They've used it twice with the same vendor, where they've been misidentified with crimes. And now through the booking system, their biometrics sit in these systems for no reason. So I'm gonna open the floor to others to comment, but it was very rough and reputationally, very rough. People would openly say that I was lying, and I was like, no, this is science. But now we have to believe science.
Thank you. Anaïs? Are you muted?
No, I'm just saying this is so wonderful to hear you, Mutale, and I think you're giving me a way to respond to Peter's question from prior. I think one of the key of the thing that you shared about your work is the need, the immense urge for literacy education. I mean, the fact that there is the need to implement some forms of access to knowledge, and if anything else, the COVID has also sparked some responsibility from the white people community to address some of their own biases. So I'll go back to the question of, I like your use of faulty technologies. I think it responds to the question that Peter asked about, whether technology can be racist. In using Simon Brown's amazing work, Dark Matter, the lantern itself is not racist, right? The pen that writes, the car that drives, but if the lantern is used for close to a dark shaded skin, so the white shaded ones don't accuse, don't scream. If the pen that writes poem and not bills to sell the slave, if the iron that forge the structure of a house is not the iron that we found on the foot of the slave, I mean, every technology has the potential to become. And I love that you ended with designing the future. I mean, the immense revolution of the digital is that it also opening up possibilities at the speed of light. But it is closing down at the speed of light as well, because we are not yet ready to assume the fact that our societies are still completely shaped by racist and misogynist structures. And the structures found their fundamental fuel in the culture that sustains it. So that's why I had a difficulty about responding to your question, Peter, because yes, we need to point out to the biases and the faultiness, but we certainly, it should never be the excuse to deflect our responsibility for having emerged out of this culture in the first place. And so I haven't heard the thing that you mentioned, Mutale, about Obama. But I hear it often. And when I was in South Africa for 2 years, where, you know, it's not even 30 years at the end of the apartheid. So all the people I would meet are people who are completely viscerally traumatized. And as a white body, the things that I will produce in this relational interactions were beyond my capacity to point down. You know, there is something about the fact that there is a huge work to do. And so I go back to, you know, racial literacy, racial understanding, gender biases, gender literacy, gender education. Because otherwise we're going to just continue to produce, and the technology will just reflect or increase those biases. That will yeah, again, the lantern can be used to welcome the stranger or to be put by the shoulder of the black man, so the white lady is not scared. So yeah, that's but there are questions by the students or maybe
Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, so I suggest to ask all the questions and to let you respond to the order that you will prefer. So for the recording, I have to ask the question. So we have another question from Alice Krupev. So this is a question of looking backwards in technologies. So I don't know if she wants to speak up directly. Alice?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I was just wondering, so we've been talking a lot about looking forward with technology and looking at progress, but I was thinking in terms of racial and social profiling, what could we say about actually people who look backwards? So what I mean about this is, for example, in the UK in the past, let's say 5 years, there's been some anecdotal kind of articles that have been coming out saying that the Nokia brick phone, as we call it, is the phone of the drug dealers. So in a sense, it's sort of, I'm just wondering, what can we say about this double incrimination, in the sense that these, say, for example, people who are drug dealers or who are doing some kind of illegal activity, so they would not carry a cell phone, a smartphone, precisely not to be tracked. But then again, if they are caught with this kind of low capacity phone, that also has a very strong connotation that they are hiding something. So I'm not sure just what could we say about these things, and what can we, does this just effectively mean that both sides are heavily connotated? Sorry, I'm not sure if this is too far away from what we're discussing.
I just want to repeat so that I understand it completely, Alice. So the question is really about what value in studying of technology do we have in looking at the social meanings of the technology, or is it a question around the technological architecture itself? I can answer in
Alice, are you still there? Okay.
I think that's the issue. I'm not quite clear on it.
So in my work, I look at the social.
Not very good.
In my work, I look at the social meaning of the technology, and my work is genealogical. So I'm always looking to past histories of power. My fascination is the power between white people and non-white people. But then I'm intersectional in that. So I'm always looking at women, trans folks, non-binary folks, children, those that have the least power. And one of the things the reason that I do that in my own work is exactly what Anaïs was saying, that the AI that we have now, this algorithmically driven technical suite, at one point was a wheel, at one point was fire, at one point was a lamp. So what was the most advanced technology in that day, and how did it reinforce legally defined structures of power? So in the British context, in the French context, in the colonial context, you have all of these rules that ultimately lead to all of these legal rules that ultimately lead to white people winning, white men specifically winning, and everybody else losing. And people lose at different rates, right? In the South African context, you have coloreds that are disenfranchised, but not so much as Africans, but not so much as et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when I look at the technical, and I'm looking at histories of the technical, I'm always looking at key inflection points where technological advance, for example, the lamp, is used to reinforce existing notions of power. So in this moment, we're looking at tracking technology of, COVID tracking technology. And from the beginning, I was like, number one, it doesn't work. Number two, I don't want to tell people my social graph. Number three, I'm certainly not giving Google of all the stuff they already know about me. They don't need to know my heartbeat. I'm good. And number four, there at some point is going to be a world in which we have a vaccine, and that ended up being a couple of months later, but to me that was a technical grab for more information to create more products. And the reason that I was able to make that leap is that I know that the colonization project is about grabbing resources, whether they be land, whether they be minerals, and in this case it's data. And that makes me very suspicious. It makes me an expert on technology that doesn't use a lot of technology, right? Much of my life lives on analog. It makes me an expert of technology that focuses on power. It makes me, and I wouldn't be able to do that work if I looked at social histories. In terms of technical design, the reason that I don't find that particularly efficacious or even fascinating is that technology is often not finished. If we had watched the rest of that video, what they say is the Pepper robot isn't finished and we need more data. Please help us make Pepper better. And my thing is, no, I think Pepper is a horrendous idea, and stop reinforcing the idea that women are servants and just greet people. Hire some people, have good labor practices. Nobody is working through COVID, let's do that. So date culture in technology means that it's almost impossible for me to make that shift because technologies themselves are already in development. I hope that answered your question.
I don't know if Anaïs, you want to add something?
I'm still thinking.
Okay, you will have another chance to.
I think that there are, yeah.
We have many questions, so really, I suggest to tell the question, all of them first, and let you the time to answer all of them. So we have another question from Tobias Carr. He's asking a question about threat of opacity, I guess. So for example, there has been discussion about the potential for software used in the insurance industry to deem individuals as risky due to categorization and intersections invisible even to the software user. So this is his question. We have another question from Mark Veltman. What kind of bias are usual in Chinese facial recognition software? I don't know if someone can respond that question. And we have two other students who would like to ask you directly a question. So I add them to the discussion. Aisha, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you to Anaïs and Mutale. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. I think my question is going off the very empowering idea that we can influence the future and how technology is used in the future. And it's about what scholar Louis Shudesoke called false universalism, or the risk of a false universalism of taking the Black experience and Blackness in US American context as the experience of Blackness globally. So I think my question is, because there's so much inspiring and important research and knowledge production coming out of the United States, especially now, do you factor this idea of a limiting idea or a false universal idea of Blackness within the US context into your work? And do you try to open it up to other experiences of Blackness?
That's a really good question. In my work, I am looking at the experience of diasporans. So I'm part of the Zambian diaspora, grew up in the United Kingdom, and now I'm living in the United States. And my conception of Blackness is really an American one, and was even in the US context, because when I lived in the US context, I found so much suppression around even expressing ideas of Blackness and even expressing ideas of colonity. While I was very young, that was very taboo and very discouraged, and still is, by the way, in the US context. I recently did a disinformation project that was looking at ideas of digital Blackness, and was told that I should look at white people. And I was flabbergasted. I was like, when you asked me here, you didn't like read anything? Oh, okay. And just kept talking about Black people. So in terms of conceptualizing after that, I am really excited about working with scholars that are doing the work in their own context, because I don't think that it's the job of somebody who is an expert in a particular space to speak for the whole. That's definitely difficult in some spaces. You know, France, for example, not collecting racial data. I'm not quite sure how that work is done. But certainly looking to colleagues specifically in Brazil, who have been doing a lot of exciting work, and African scholars as well. But they don't conceptualize Blackness in the same way in an environment where it's Black, right? There are other points of difference and power differentials that are looked at. So that would be my honest example. I don't know that it's my place to look at an international Blackness that I haven't lived.
That says a lot.
Yeah, very interesting. Ocean, sorry, Ocean, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure. So hello, first off, thank you very much. I think my question would be directed more to Mutale. It's to come back about Pepper, because you said, so I found it really interesting, the fact that she was classified as women, hence servant, and then white, hence intelligent. But so I wondered what type of characteristics Pepper could have if you want to, decolonize the technology. Because, for instance, if Pepper was Black, it would have sparked outrage, like rightfully. And so I feel like there's some, like, for instance, the characteristics would be self-predictive. If the robot, for instance, is white, then we'll say, oh, because it's because like it's to show intelligence. And so yeah, I don't quite see how we can make a neutral technology. Like the dream of having, the universal, the abstract person, which is pretty French as well, I believe. Well, would probably come back to putting a white man, or should we just skip on human characteristics and just make it a robot like E.T. or so? Yeah, it's just a very pragmatic question. But how would you, I don't know, redesign Pepper, for instance?
I would hire.
We could link this to the last question as well. This question of universalism and the local.
Yeah.
I would hire a person and give them decent wages and create a whole industry that put people in. I don't think we need robots for everything, right? I think in your question is this assumption that Pepper is a credible project. And I just wonder whether we could move to a future where we decide whether we actually need a technological intervention, or what we need is something quite different. Now, PEP is really interesting because I've been to hundreds of conferences in my time and never required a greeter. And I don't know whether that's because I'm a poor person who's used to doing things myself, and I'm going to conferences with the royal family where they require greeters to get people. But for most poor people, we can just walk through a door without the need to be greeted. And in my view, Pepper is really what happens when technological capitalism is looking for a market. Oh, we need greeters. Oh, the greeters are $500 million. We're going to create Pepper. So there was absolutely no need. And then you have this offensive robot. I think that's not to say that your question isn't credible, but I would be just going back to what Professor Burgess was saying, and you're right. In the American context, Pepper being a Black woman would have been absolute uproar, because we actually do have a history here of Black women being hired as domestic servants, not being paid, because I'm sure Pepper isn't paid, has no health insurance. So there was a time in American history where through enslavement and then Jim Crow, Pepper was actually a Black woman, probably somebody that looked like me. So it wouldn't work in this context. However, I'm also Zambian. And in the Zambian context, I am from an elite tribe. My family and the history of my family is one of power and privilege. And we actually have people that live in our houses to do domestic work. And those people are also Zambians, and they're also white. The power differential really comes from these tribal demarcations. And in the Zambian context, if we had Pepper in our houses, instead of the people that often live in our houses who come to our houses so that they can get education and get some of the fringe benefits. It doesn't always work this way, but the idea is that you bring in somebody from the village and then you enrich that person by giving them the gift of education, that they can then go back to the village and feed their families. We would be disrupting a social system that has worked for millennia. So I don't know whether my sometimes decolonity in technology is asking the very radical question, is this the place that we need a technical intervention?
I think it's fantastic, because we are now complicating the intersectional in adding class into the difficult layers of technology and power and gender and race and class and history within those forms of and so in the opening pages of a book that is called On the Modes of Existence of Technical Object, this philosopher's name, Gilbert Simondon, is making a parallel between the fact that we have a fantasy about robots and we have a fantasy about strangers. And he is making this in few pages, few paragraphs, and then he completely drops the question of the other or otherness. But Mutale, you bring something so fundamental, and that is the question of the need. And so if we want to design the future, while acknowledging the long legacy of technological implication of power, I like to tell you about the thing about this philosopher. And the humanoid is often thought as a threatening force, as if suddenly they were going to take over, as much as the stranger. If you welcome the stranger, then he will take over. And so it's this way for this philosopher to question a very European-centric understanding of alterity. So in not recognizing the human reality in the technical object, as much as you don't recognize the human reality in any form of human being, then you produces fear of threats, and then you act as in the stance of a potential threat. And so the complexity of adding class to this question is that it's also adding the possibility of the threat of losing, you know, this structural proprietary superiority that gives access to different privilege. I don't know where I'm going with all of that. I'm just responding. But one thing I want to respond, there is someone who is asking about the Chinese software facial recognition system. I mentioned the Chinese credit score system that is based on the implementation of facial recognition at the state of almost 1.3 billion citizens. What is very similar to actually medical files and credit scores files and economic files and all of that, is that it's based on your interactions with others, with institutions, with economic growth, and so you are given a score, much like in the United States, you are given a score. But you, in the Chinese credit score system, you are given a score at birth, and you die with it. And you are given a certain amount of points, and if you do good, you raise your points. If you engage with people who do good, you raise your points, and if you do wrong, you can lose everything to your passport, so you cannot even escape. So that's why I was talking about this philosopher Antoinette Rouvroy, who was the first to coin the question of algorithmic governmentality, even though things have been preempted from her quite widely. But it's been like 15 years ago that she talked about that. But it's because there is a wider machinery, and so it was a good reminder that Mutale was saying that coloniality is about grabbing. So if decoloniality is the opposite of grabbing, then what are we doing? What are we doing with and so it's time off, but so I'm not grabbing more time.
No, I didn't. That wasn't a signal to you. That was a signal. What the opposite of grabbing is letting go.
Letting go. Oh, okay. I thought it was the time we had finished with.
No, I'm sorry.
And I think one of the things that we can let go is this idea that this, you know, technical Calvary that we're building, we're marching. We have a global pandemic. What is the first thing we do? We create an app, when what we need to do is stop. We need to think about what got us here. Why is it that Black people are dying more? What was the underlying system with that? Why is it that science and empirical evidence has been so demonized that in the face of that, we're not moving forward? And then what systems, and taking this systematic idea, what systems can we create to make sure that we don't do this? And then what technical tools get us there? So, you know, are we optimizing technologies that increase access to food, clean water, clean health, are we optimizing those, or are we optimizing pepper that is engaged in a nonsense, in my view, endeavor? Because all she actually does is, when you go to the conference, you say, where is the third, you know, where's the session on decolonial technology? And then Pepper will say, it's down the hall, ma'am. When you could actually have read that information, you could actually have explored that.
Well, I think it's the time to stop the discussion. I'm very sorry, but thank you again, both of you, for this fascinating conversation. It's always a bit frustrating because we have the feeling that we miss the time to go further, the more questions. Maybe Peter, you would like to say a few words?
Oh yeah, I'll just summarize. No, thank you very much to both of you. It was really inspiring, and there were so many things we didn't manage to talk about. This is sort of the essence of intersectionality, of course. I mean, I thought Ocean Mascara, she said her question was simple and pragmatic, but it might have been the core question. You know, what is the alternative to this? What is the alternative to pepper? And what is the alternative to these technologies, to technology in general? And it might even be an ontological question. You know, there's a new, there's this new branch of, it's falling under feminist queer research about quantum theory. I'm thinking of Karen Barad and pragmatic realism, where she says the whole problem is in our belief that we're in a binary system, that it's yes, no, true, false, which is the foundation of algorithms and coding. So if the world is not like that, maybe we need to think a little bit more about alternatives to binary thinking. There on that ballooning abstract thought. Thank you very much again.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's make me think about the fact that this is also, I think, a question of what are the epistemic effects as well, how it's shaping our knowledge in general, how this technological tools are actually reframing the way that we will build our knowledge on the diverse topics we are trying to study in this seminar. So again, thank you so much, Mutale and Anaïs, for this fascinating discussion. Next week, we will have our almost final session on border and technology innovation. And we will have for the session Claudia Arado, which is professor at King's College London in international relations. And we will have also the member of European Parliament, Fabienne Keller. So thank you again, all the participants, for the brilliant questions today, and see you next week.